But anyway, I'm very, very glad that everyone is here tonight for this first of 4 talks on an introduction to the faith. And we're going to be looking at the faith in a way that we're not probably very used to. And so it's something that we should really get at some point, though, in our religious formation. It's something that we could really, really benefit. Oftentimes we go to Mass every Sunday, twice a year, whatever it is, and we pick up certain ideas about the faith, which, of course, reading the Gospels, hearing the prayers of the church, we're bound to walk away with a certain degree of knowledge about our faith. But there's a lot that we miss. There's a lot that we miss. And of course, there's that kind of central question that can kind of plague us, that is the whole reason behind giving these talks. And that's the question, yeah, but is it really true? But is it really true? And can we look at the faith and really get into that question of, is it really true? Can we start to find some evidence that suggests that it actually is true? It's not just a bunch of really nice ideas that we all kind of come together to share, but is there truth behind it? Just first of all, a little bit of background on myself. I'm Father Joshua Clifton. I'm the parochial vicar here at Madonna del Sasso Church. This is my first priestly assignment. I was ordained last May 19th and was assigned here. Prior to being here, I was a deacon in Gonzales at St. Theodore's Parish. I went through all public schools all my life. I went all the way through high school public schools, and then I went to Berkeley, where I studied religious studies with an emphasis in religion. And then after that, I went into the seminary, which was my first Catholic school. And I spent about 5 years at St. Patrick's Seminary in Menlo Park. I spent a year at St. John Vianney Seminary in Denver. And then I spent a year at Mount Angel Seminary in Mount Angel, Oregon. And then in the course of that whole experience, I spent about 4 years teaching high school religion. I spent 2 years teaching at Mission College Prep down in San Luis Obispo, where I'm from. And then I spent 2 years teaching at a Catholic high school in New Jersey at Paramus Catholic. And I bring my experience from seminary and indeed as a teacher into this topic as well, because when I was in the seminary, it was during the course of my studies and studying philosophy that we really get into these questions of, does God exist? How can we know God exists? And I found it to be, of course, enthralling, frankly. And so as I began to teach high school and teaching confirmation courses and whatnot, I brought that into the classroom. And I found that the high school students really benefited from that kind of a study, because when we get to about high school is when we really start to have big questions. And we start to kind of really question, yeah, but is all this true or not? And so it was kind of coming from that experience and saying, hey, you know what? I bet a lot of people in the parish have these kinds of questions as well. Surely the fact that some people come to Mass a couple of times a year, some come every Sunday, some don't come at all, it shows you that there is a need for this, that there's an interest in this. How can we know if it's true? So I bring that to this particular talk here tonight. This talk will be different than the next 3. This talk, by its nature, the question of God's existence, is very philosophical. It's very philosophical. It's going to require some kind of mind-bending cognition that we're not used to doing. And I hope it doesn't scare you away. I hope you don't think that, oh my gosh, this is so deeply philosophical. I don't know if I can handle 4 nights of this. But this is a unique night. This is a unique night because it's getting into the question of, does God really exist? And how can we know it? But it's important when we approach this topic to be able to recognize a few facts about it. And that is basically that the question of God's existence is like anything else, where there's kind of a right answer and a wrong answer. And it's not really based on feeling, it's not based on opinion. There's sort of a brute fact that we're dealing with here. So for example, there are some people who believe in no God. We call those atheists. And then we have Christians who believe in one God. But then you have other religions that believe in more gods. So, for example, the Hindus ultimately believe in 360 million gods. Now, there's a fact that we have to recognize when we look at those three traditions, atheism, Christianity, and Hinduism. One can be right, or they can all be wrong. But we can't say that they're all right, you see. If there is no God, then the Christians and the Hindus are wrong. If there is a God, then the atheists are wrong. And it's not meant to be any disrespect towards any particular school of philosophy or any religious tradition for that matter. In fact, I could say right off the bat that I have a deep respect for the religions of the world. That was my course of study in college, and I enjoyed studying Hinduism in particular. It's a beautiful tradition. But either there are 360 million gods, or there is one God, or there are no gods. But we can't say that they're all right. It's not a matter of taste, like I like ham and you don't. It's a matter of a fact, so we have to uncover that fact. So as we get into this, I just want to point out a couple of things. This talk, I'm only going to talk for about an hour, probably a little bit less. And then at the end, I'm going to give an opportunity to ask questions. I have a little microphone, if you're comfortable using it, you don't have to ask questions, and I'll answer them. After the talk, though, if you want to go, you're free to go. I'm not going to keep you. I mean, of course, you're free to go anytime, but you don't feel like you have to stay for the questions. And then at any point during the questions, if you want to go, you can certainly go. This talk will be available on our website. So if you go to mdschurch.org and you click on Introduction to the Faith, you'll see the 4 talks listed. And if you click on this first one, you'll see a YouTube video embedded that has this talk. So if there's anything you forgot or anything you want to go back and look at, you can go on to that video. What's more, if you look above those 4 talks, you'll see my email address. And you can email me any questions you have about this subject matter. So if you don't want to stay tonight to ask questions, or you want to think a little bit about how you want to ask it, you're free to email me as well. It might take me a couple of days to get back to you, but I will get back to you, I hope with a satisfactory answer. So there are different ways that we can approach this, okay? There are different ways that we can be involved in these 4 talks. And again, it will take a few days for the video to get up online. So we're looking at the question of the existence of God, proofs for the existence of God even. And that's why tonight is subtitled Reasons to Believe. Now, there are different ways to prove something. So there are what are called empirical proofs. This is a proof where I can demonstrate something to you. I could say that water freezes once it hits 32 degrees. And I could demonstrate that. I could fill up an ice tray with water. I could put it in the freezer. We could wait a certain amount of time. I could pull it out and I could show you the ice cubes. And I could demonstrate to you, I could prove to you that water freezes at a certain temperature. What's more, I could demonstrate that water boils at 212 degrees. And I could just demonstrate that for you. That's an empirical proof. That's something that you can see. It's something that I can repeat like an experiment. But besides empirical proofs, there are rational proofs. These are proofs for something that I can't demonstrate for you scientifically, but using our ability to reason, we can see that something has to be true. And we can know something is true with the same degree of certainty that we can know that an empirical proof is true. So we can know something using reason with the same degree of certainty that we can state a scientific fact. It's not the same thing, but they're 2 different ways to prove something with certainty. So an example of a rational proof would be something sort of like this. If I were to tell you that parallel lines never touch, I could demonstrate that for you, but I couldn't write 2 parallel lines and keep walking and walking and walking and say, well, we're just going to walk to the edge of the universe and we're going to see that they never touch. I can't demonstrate it to you in that sense, but I can show you that it is the case. So that's sort of what a rational proof is. And there are a number of rational proofs for the existence of God. There are 5 famous proofs of St. Thomas Aquinas. We call them the 5 ways. And what I want to do tonight is I want to look basically at 2 of them. I want to show you 2 proofs for God's existence. Not scientific proofs, but proofs using reason alone. And they're very philosophical in nature, but I think we'll be able to grasp them if I am able to explain it adequately to you. The first proof gets into what I would say is the deepest question we could ever ask about anything. Now think about that for a second. The deepest question we could ever ask about anything. I wouldn't say it's the most important question. I would say the most important question we could ever ask is whether or not the Catholic faith is true. I think that's the most important question we could ever ask. Because if this faith is true, that changes everything. If this faith is not true, that changes everything. The answer to that question will change everything. But there is a deep question, the deepest question we could ever ask. And that's something else entirely different. And I can't just say it. I have to kind of take you there. And so we could begin by looking at ourselves. Now, all of us here are at various ages. Some of us are older, some of us are younger. But there was a time when nobody in this church right now existed. To go back 100 years, nobody here existed. Now, our own existence is not necessary. What do I mean by that? 2 and 2 has to be 4. That is necessary. That's a logical necessity. We couldn't vote and make 2 plus 2 be 5. We couldn't say, well, I think 2 plus 2 is 5 for me. No. 2 and 2 is 4. That's a rational necessity. But your existence and mine is not necessary. It's not logically necessary. In other words, before we came to be, before we were born, this world got along just fine without us. Okay? So we do not necessarily have to exist. I'm going to give you a fancy vocabulary word. When something does not need to exist, we say that it is contingent. It is contingent. So all of you and myself, we are contingent. We don't need to exist. We don't logically need to exist. But if we take that question further, we find that there are a lot of contingent things. So, for example, this planet that we're on, Earth, and all the life in it, the moon, it doesn't need to exist. You can imagine our solar system without Earth. You can imagine Mercury, Venus, a big wide space, and then Mars. It's possible. It's possible that we can conceive of that. The Earth is not necessary. In fact, neither is the solar system. In fact, if you think about it, if you can really let your mind go, nothing in the universe needs to exist. Imagine the universe completely empty. A dark, cold, silent expanse with no stars, no planets, no comets. Imagine a universe that is completely empty. It could have been that way. It's not necessary that it have everything that it has. Now, here's where I'm going to take you over the edge. See if you can do this. Imagine a universe that is not only dark and empty, but imagine that even that darkness and that emptiness does not exist. It's a big fat nothing. It's impossible to think about, really. It's not even dark. It's not even empty. Imagine nothing. With a big capital N, nothing. It's impossible to imagine. But here is the point. That could have been our reality. It could have been that nothing would exist. And I mean that nothing with a big capital N. Not dark, not cold, not even empty. a universe that is not even empty space. It's hard to conceive. But do you realize that it is not necessary that anything would exist? It's not necessary that there be a big empty expanse. It's not necessary that there would be planets and stars and swirling galaxies. It's not necessary. So the deepest question we could ever ask about anything is this: why is there something instead of nothing? Why is there something instead of nothing? Now that's a question that often doesn't cross our minds. We get up in the morning, we pour our cold cereal, we go to work, we go to school. We take our existence for granted. And I'm not saying that it doesn't exist. Clearly the world exists. But do we ever stop and say, yeah, but why? How? How does anything exist at all? When you use logic, it kind of shouldn't exist. It's easier for something not to exist than to exist. There's this principle which can be applied to this. It's the principle of Occam's razor. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of this, but Occam's razor. And it's basically this principle that the simplest explanation is usually the right one. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. So say you leave for the day and you have a cat and you leave the cat indoors, close all the doors, and you come back later and you find that your furniture has these vertical scratch marks in it. Now, you weren't there to see what happened. There were no cameras. Now, you have to make a decision. You can say, well, clearly, aliens came down from outer space, and they were conducting experiments on furniture, and they had to make these scratch marks to take their samples and go back to their home planet. Well, obviously not. We say, what is the simplest explanation? The simplest explanation is that the cat scratched the furniture. We can know that basically with certainty. It's kind of a rational proof right there. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. And that principle of simplicity can be applied to anything. That things tend towards the simple. Things don't just happen like aliens coming down and tearing up your furniture. And if you take that principle and apply it, things don't just pop into existence. Every bit of matter, every bit of energy that exists in this universe has existed since its beginning. There are not new things popping into existence and old things popping out of existence. Everything that exists in this world has existed since the beginning of the universe. Things don't just pop in and out of existence. So we can kind of use something like Occam's razor to look at the universe and say, well, why does anything exist at all? Nothing should be here. We shouldn't even be here asking the question, because things don't just exist for no reason. The whole universe is contingent. The whole universe and everything in it is not necessary. So, once we establish that fact, once we kind of realize, okay, wow, this world, this bench I'm sitting on, this world I live in, it doesn't have to be here. There's no certainty that requires it to be here, like 2 and 2 is 4. Then we have to ask ourselves a question. Well, how did it get here? How did it get here? And there are a couple of answers. There are a couple of possibilities, let's say. They can't all be right, but there are a couple of possibilities, and we're going to look at each one of them. The first one is to say that the universe always existed. It has always existed. That's why it's here. Okay? Now, we can shoot that one down real quick, and I'm going to show you. And again, it's going to require a little bit of mind-bending use of the brain, okay? Use of philosophy and philosophical principles. But we can show that the universe has to have a beginning using philosophy alone. And this is kind of a half-proof of God's existence in and of itself. When I was in college, we were talking about the age of the universe, and there was a question, this was in the late 90s, of whether the universe had always existed or not. And the thought was, well, perhaps our universe, there was the Big Bang, and then eventually everything in the universe is going to retract on itself, and there's going to be another Big Bang, and it goes through these countless cycles. But at some point in the early 2000s, they discovered that this was not the case. That this universe, there was a Big Bang, and that now, 13.8 billion years later, we are here. And that this universe is going to continue to expand, in fact, at an accelerating rate, and it will not suck back up into a little tiny singularity again. This universe is a one-time deal. Now, we didn't know that in the late 90s. We know that now. Astrophysicists have been able to demonstrate that. So we already actually have an empirical proof that this universe has a beginning. But let me show you why it is impossible for the universe to always have existed. Okay. If you count, can you ever reach infinity? No. You can count and you can count and you can count and you can get to a very high number, but you can never get to infinity. You can never reach it. Okay? Now, if our universe has always existed, that would mean that an infinite number of moments would have had to have gone by just to get to now. But it's impossible to have reached infinity. Let me explain it again because it's easy to miss it, okay? Imagine like a timeline, right? Like if we had a line written here and this goes back into the past, like this is 10 seconds ago, 20 seconds ago, right? And then this is the future. This is a timeline into the future, okay? If time goes infinitely into the past, that means to get to this moment, we would have had to have crossed an infinite distance just to get to now. But it's impossible to reach infinity. It would be impossible to get to the present moment because an infinite number of moments would have had to have gone by, and that's impossible. Don't worry if you don't quite get it. Email me if you don't. I'll try to explain it, okay? This is actually called the Kalam argument for God's existence. It's to show the universe had to have a beginning. Okay, the universe had to start at a particular moment. Now people will say, but wait a minute. If the universe started at a certain moment, what happened before that moment? Huh? But here's the interesting thing about time. Time is the measurement of movement, of matter. It's saying that this moved and then that moved and then that moved. That's what it is. Before anything existed, there would be no way to keep time. There would be no seconds ticking by. In order for seconds to tick by, this is Einstein's relativity, okay? That time is based on the movement of matter, more or less. So asking what happened before time began is sort of like saying what's north of the North Pole. There isn't anything. It all goes to a point. Right? All those points of longitude all meet at one little point. That's the beginning of it. Now, that's hard for us to grasp, but that's the reality, is that time did have a beginning. So, if the universe cannot have always existed, we're left with two possibilities. Either the universe just popped into existence for no reason at all, or something created it. We're left with those two choices. Either the universe just happened for no reason, or something created it. Now, each one of those has their own problems, each of those explanations. If we say that it just happened for no reason, that's saying that all of reality is utterly absurd. Because things don't just pop into existence. They don't. There's nothing here or anywhere in the universe that has not existed since the beginning. You see, every atom, every bit of energy that exists in this universe 13.8 billion years ago was crammed into something that was incredibly tiny. Incredibly tiny. They say about half the width of a nucleus of an atom. That every cell in your body and mine and the moon and the most distant quasar, that everything was crammed into a singularity. And that singularity then burst in what we call the Big Bang. And that over the course of the years, the elements began to form, later the stars and the planets, and eventually life. But nothing has popped in or out of existence since then. I mean, they have something kind of like that. They say that in empty space, which isn't really empty space is a something, not a nothing, remember? That little particles can kind of come in and out of existence, but it happens in this field of potentiality, we could say, right? That's the nature of the universe, that little things can kind of pop in and out, but there's a background to it. It's sort of like seeds grow out of the soil, right? If you put a seed in the soil, it grows into a plant. You don't just have a plant grow out of nothing, you see? Though that seems to be exactly what happened at the first moment of the universe. Something just popped into existence. But it would be impossible for us to be sitting here and for all of a sudden an elephant to manifest itself and just fall to the floor. It doesn't happen. It's utterly absurd. So we have to dismiss that idea that the universe is just here. It just happened. That doesn't make any sense. That's utterly unreasonable. The universe, nothing just pops into existence. So we have to get rid of that. So then we can say, well, maybe God or a being created the universe. But then you run into another problem. See, each one of these three explanations have their own problems. If we say that God created the universe, your next question will be, okay, then who created God? Then who created God, right? Now, I could say, well, another God created him. And you say, well, what about him? Well, then another God created him. You see, that's an infinite regress, right? But there's something that we can do here. There's a little change that we can make that will answer this question. If we ask the question, who created God? Then what we are doing is calling God contingent. A God who creates the universe that needed to be created by something else. We needed to be created because we're contingent. We're not necessary. But what if God is not a contingent being? He's not a being that doesn't have to exist. But what if God, by definition, is a necessary being? God is a necessary being. That God's existence is an absolute certainty. That for God not to exist would be like 2 + 2 = 5. That the existence of God is a brute reality. If we were necessary, we wouldn't have to have this discussion. If you were necessary and I was necessary and the whole universe was necessary, we wouldn't even have to bring God into it. But we already know that we're not necessary, that the universe isn't necessary. We know because we can kind of imagine it not existing. But what if God, by definition, is necessary? Then that's your proof of God's existence. So to sum it up, it goes something like this. Proof of God's existence, number 1. Nothing has to exist. Everything is contingent. In order for this world to exist, something necessary had to create it. This world does not need to exist. It is contingent. In order for it to exist, something necessary had to create it. That's something we call God. Okay? Now, once we have that, that's just proof number 1. I got another one for you. Once we know that there has to be a God, Otherwise, nothing would be here. Once we know that, we know a few other things. For example, we know that there's only one God. We can prove it that there's only one God. How? Because if you had two gods, one would be necessary, one wouldn't. You see, one God is all you need to create a universe. If there are other gods, they are not necessary. They are contingent. Now, God could create other beings that are not necessary, but there can't be two necessary beings. There can only be one. By definition, any extra God after that is not necessary. So we can prove that there is a God and that this God necessarily exists. And we can say a number of other things about this God. This God is not some unthinking force like gravity. This God has free will. This God was not compelled to create the universe, like something is compelled to fall as a result of gravity. This God would have to choose to do it. This God, by definition, must be infinitely powerful, in order to create something out of nothing. You see, we, as mankind, we've been able to do an incredible amount we've been able to complete an incredible amount of scientific progress. Look how much our technology has improved even in the last 10 or 20 years. We can do a lot, but we can't make something out of nothing. And we never will be. We'll never be able to do that. There's kind of a joke where some scientists got together and they got some salt water and they put in amino acids and they put in some sand and mud and everything else, and they began to shock it with electric shocks and they began to create life. And they said, "See, God, we don't need you. We've created life." And God says, "Really? Let me see." And they say, "Yeah, look, we took this dirt and God goes, whoa, whoa, whoa. Get your own dirt." You see, we could never create something out of nothing for all of our scientific advances. Only God can do that, so God is infinitely powerful. Additionally, for God to make a universe that is the nature of our universe, with its incredible complexity, including being able to create us to the degree of sophistication our brains and our minds have, means that God himself must be infinitely intelligent. Okay? God's not like some buffoon that accidentally created something really intelligent. God's not like a bunch of monkeys sitting at typewriters accidentally typing up Shakespeare. God has to be infinitely intelligent in order to create a universe with the degree of scientific complexity that it has. So that's our first proof, that God created the world out of nothing, that God is a necessary being. The second proof comes from it. The second proof is something we've already begun to talk about, the complexity, the nature of our universe. We have in physics what are called the four forces, okay? One of them, gravity, we've already talked about. So gravity is a force. It's one of the forces in the universe. We've also heard of magnetism and electricity, okay? Now, those together make up what's called the electromagnetic force, okay? So electricity and magnetism are really closely tied together. In fact, as you may know, all electricity is created through magnetism when it comes right down to it. Whether you have a nuclear plant, whether you have a coal plant, what you have is a magnet spinning in a coil of wire. I remember in fourth grade, the teacher brought a little generator, and you would turn it, and it turned a magnet in a coil of water, in a coil of wire. And he had all the students hold hands with this two students on the end touching either end of the generator. And he turned it, and we all got shocked. We felt the shock passing through our hands. So electromagnetism is a force in the universe. There are also two other forces that you rarely hear about. The first is the strong force, and the other is the weak force. And the strong force is basically what holds the nucleus of an atom together, okay? And then the weak force has to do with the rate of decay of an atom, okay, radiation. So these four forces are constants, meaning they don't change. So gravity here on Earth, tomorrow we're not going to get up and start floating around or be pressed down onto the ground. Gravity is a constant. It has a constant force. Now, the strength of gravity is also contingent. It could have been that when the universe was first created, that gravity could have been much stronger. So, for example, that to be on an Earth of our size, we would kind of walk around like we're on the moon, right? And that maybe being around Jupiter would be like gravity like this. It could have been that gravity could have been stronger or weaker. Gravity, by the way, is very, very, very weak. So weak that if you had a needle sitting here and you had a little tiny magnet, you could pick up that needle. And it's fighting against the gravity of the entire Earth pulling down on that needle. So gravity is very weak, but a little magnet can pick a pin up and go against the gravity of the entire planet. It's very, very, very weak, but it's a constant. Electromagnetism has a certain strength. The strong force and the weak force, they are constants, they don't change. Now, if you were to go back to the very beginning of the universe and make gravity slightly stronger, just slightly stronger, what astrophysicists tell us is that the universe, at its first moment, when you had the Big Bang, it would have exploded, and then gravity would have overcome it, and it would have shrunk back to a little tiny singularity again. It would have exploded and shrunk and exploded. It would have never been able to spread out. Additionally, if gravity was just a little bit weaker, then the universe would have spread out so much that we wouldn't be able to form planets. Everything would have been too weak. It would have spread out. That gravity is at the exact strength that it is necessary for life to have existed. What's true of gravity is true of electromagnetism, is true of the strong force, and is true of the weak force. There's a beautiful book written by a priest who's now deceased named Thomas Dubay, Father Thomas Dubay, and he wrote a book called The Evidential Power of Beauty. It's a great book. I recommend it. And what he does is he just talks about all these different things in the universe that have to be just so in order for life to exist. And he quotes an astrophysicist who says that the odds that those four forces of the universe, gravity, electromagnetism, the strong force, and the weak force, would be so perfectly tuned for life to exist. The odds that would happen are the same odds that if you took a dart, like a throwing dart, and you threw it across the entire universe, and it hit the most distant quasar, and it hit a bullseye 1 millimeter in width. Imagine the odds of that. That you were to throw a dart and it would go all the way across the universe and you'd hit a bullseye 1 millimeter wide. Imagine that if you miss it even slightly, that life can't exist. That's where we're at. Not only would life not exist, matter wouldn't exist. You wouldn't be able to have atoms that form. You wouldn't be able to have elements, much less life. In order for life to exist, those four forces had to be in perfect balance. They have a name for this, and they call it the anthropic principle. The anthropic principle, coming from the Greek anthropos, which means man. It's like the universe almost seems to be designed in such a way that life can come into existence. The anthropic principle. Now, as you may know, I don't know about the vast majority, but a number of scientists, a lot of scientists are atheists. And you think, how can this be? If they study these things and they see this, how can they be atheists? And I'd say there are two reasons. The first is that scientists are great physicists, but they're oftentimes terrible metaphysicists. What do I mean by that? Scientists do a really good job explaining the universe and why it operates in the way that it does, but they do a really bad job of explaining why it is here in the first place. That whole question of why is there something instead of nothing. So, for example, Stephen Hawking, who's the brilliant astrophysicist, one of the most intelligent people alive, he wrote a book, and I remember coming across a newspaper article about it. And he said that he found the answer to why there is something instead of nothing. I was intrigued. So I looked it up. I looked it up in his book. And what he says is that given certain mathematical formulas and given a field of potentiality for matter to exist, that these equations would lead to matter coming into existence. Now, anyone who's had a year of philosophy, anyone who's been here for the last half an hour while we've been talking about this would say, well, wait a minute. That's not saying why there's something instead of nothing. That's saying why there's something more complex than something very simple. He didn't start with nothing. He started with formulas. He started with a universe that could potentially create matter. That's a big mistake. He's a great physicist, a terrible metaphysicist. The other reason a lot of scientists don't accept that this is a sign of God's existence, that the universe is so perfectly designed, is they've come up with another theory, what they call the multiverse. So we live in a universe, right? So they said, well, the only explanation for why our universe is so finely tuned is that there must be a vast number of other universes, that ours is just one. There must be just countless other universes, and each one of them are balanced differently. Some has gravity slightly stronger, some has the strong force slightly weaker, and in none of those universes does life exist. We just happen to live in the nice spot where life can exist. So here we are. But there's one other little problem there. Let's apply Occam's razor. The simplest explanation is usually the right one. Okay, so there's a multiverse. Where are they? Where are these other universes? Well, they must exist. What are you going to say? There's a God that made the universe or something? So what they've done is they've created this idea that there are all these other universes that there is no proof for, no empirical proof to explain why our universe is so finely tuned. But even if, let's say that they're right, let's say that there are all these other universes that exist, we still fall back to our original question. Why is there something instead of nothing? Who created the multiverse? Instead of saying who created the universe, who created the multiverse? Because the multiverse would be contingent. It wouldn't be necessary. Okay? So the second proof is saying the universe is so finely tuned that it's a sign of intelligence. I'll give one other example, the very beautiful example. When I was in college, I took a couple of courses in molecular and cell biology. And I remember the instructor talking about water. And he said that water has some 14 different properties that if any of them was even slightly different, life would not be able to exist. If it was even slightly different, life would not be able to exist. So one of them, for example, is that when water freezes, it floats. Other liquids, when they freeze, the solid sinks to the bottom. Not so with water. With water, ice floats. Now, what this has allowed, is that when a lake, for example, freezes over, it traps the water beneath it, and that water can actually be warmer so that living things can continue to thrive. If life started in water, which is what we presume, then that sinking ice would kill everything. There'd be no way that something could survive. Something else, water retention. If you notice a drop of water and you look at it sideways, you'll see it's not flat. It actually is domed, right? Have you ever seen that? Water has a certain retention to it. That is necessary for the chemical reactions to occur in water in order for life to exist. If you've seen a picture, a diagram of a water molecule, it's a large oxygen atom with two little hydrogen atoms up towards the top. It looks like a Mickey Mouse head. Because those hydrogen atoms are not on the side, but are up top, it creates a charge. A water molecule has a charge. It's positive on one side and negative on another. That allows water molecules to basically link up. They basically link up, and that allows an electric charge to pass through it so that, again, the biological processes that are necessary for a living being can take place. That's just 3 of these 14 different properties, and that's just water. In fact, we could sit here and talk all night about various things that the universe must have for life to exist. So we have our first proof of God's existence, that something must exist, something necessary must exist that created this contingent universe. This being, therefore, must be infinitely intelligent, infinitely powerful, and totally free, have a free will. The second proof is that this universe, because it is so finely tuned and designed for the existence of life, that a God of infinite intelligence must have made it. So there are your 2 proofs. Again, there are many others, but those are the 2 I wanted to share with you today. So we can state with certainty, not from a proof that we could demonstrate, like showing how water freezes, but we can demonstrate using reason that there has to be a God. There must be a God. That there is one God, that this God is infinitely powerful, infinitely knowledgeable, and totally free. What we're going to find in our next 3 talks is that they're going to build on this reality of this God. The next question we're going to get into is Scripture. And we're going to say, okay, Father Clifton, you said that the universe is 13.8 billion years old. Bible says the world was made in 6 days. What's that all about? All right, we're going to look at that. We're going to look at the question of, can we say that the Bible really is inspired by God? Or was it just the work of some nomadic, semi-literate sheep herders in ancient Israel? We'll look at that. But as I promised, the next 3 will not be nearly as philosophical and mind-bending as tonight was. Okay, so I hope you don't say, well, that was too much and run, okay? We're going to look at those other 3 big questions, but we have a foundation. We have God. And if this God made us and made us as intelligent as we are, wouldn't it make sense that this God would communicate to us?